Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to talk about St. Patrick's life, but I want to talk a little bit too about his spirituality, because that's very important, and also the spirituality of the Irish people, and kind of the ways that they come to worship Christ in their own way, kind of centered around community, centered around nature, and centered around their own culture. Things that came out of the culture from the days of St. Patrick still are practiced. You're going to hear, you know a lot about myths about St. Patrick, right? You've heard them all. You know, the myth about Patrick teaching the Trinity with three-leaf clover, the shamrock, or him chasing the snakes out of Ireland. We're going to talk a little bit about the myths kind of at the end of the presentation. I'm going to focus really on what's kind of historical, what we know about St. Patrick, and what we can kind of glean from what we do know. And that's stuff that's important too. So I'm going to start with a prayer. Everybody should have got a handout when they came in. This is a prayer called, I am giving worship with my whole life. I think it's a pretty powerful prayer. It's full of things that we ought to say to God and never think about it, as well as things that we want to say to God. So I'd like to do this in kind of chorus form. So we'll split the room into two. I'll be with you guys. We're going to pray on the right, your right, the first grouping in the prayer. People on your left, my right, will pray the second grouping, and then we'll go back and forth and pray in that manner. But we're going to wait till Nancy gets in. Welcome, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, guys.
Those of you who aren't familiar with Nancy, you may not know her face, but you know her voice.
Absolutely.
Because she sings in the 9 o'clock choir every chance she gets, and she's the one with that deep, silky voice that's so good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We thank you. So Nancy, we're going to pray, and we're going to pray in chorus. Well, this side of the room will do the first stanza, and then this side of the room will do the second, and we'll go back and forth until we get through this prayer. Okay? So, I'll start with the right side. I believe, O God of gods, that thou art the eternal Father of life. I believe, O God of all gods, that thou art the eternal Father of love.
I believe, O God of all gods, that thou art the eternal Father of all saints. I believe, O God of all gods, that thou art the eternal Father of each one.
I believe, O God of all gods, that thou art the eternal Father of mankind. I believe, O God of all gods, that thou art the eternal Father of the world.
I believe, O Lord and God of all peoples, that thou art the creator of the high heavens, that thou art the creator of the skies above, that thou art the creator of the oceans below.
I believe, O Lord and God of the peoples, that thou art he who created my soul and set its right.
Who created my body from dust and from ashes, who gave my body breath, and to my soul its possession.
Father, bless to me my body. Father, bless to me my soul. Father, bless to me my life. Father, bless to me my belief.
Father, eternal and Lord of the peoples,
I believe that thou hast remedied my soul in the spirit of healing,
that thou gavest thy beloved Son in covenant for me, that thou hast purchased my soul with the precious blood of thy Son.
Father, eternal and Lord of life, I believe that thou dost pour on me the Spirit of grace at the bestowal of baptism.
Father, eternal and Lord of mankind, and wrap thou my body and my soul beloved. Safeguard me this night in the sanctuary of thy love. Shelter me this night in the shelter of the saints.
Thou hast brought me out from last night to the gracious light of this day. Great joy to revive my soul and to do excelling good to me.
Thanks be to thee, Jesus Christ, for the many gifts thou hast bestowed on me, each day and night, each sea and land, each weather fair, each calm, each wild.
I am giving thee worship with my whole life. I am giving thee assent with my whole power. I am giving thee praise with my whole tongue. I am giving thee honor with my whole utterance.
I am giving thee reverence with my whole understanding. I am giving thee offering with my whole thought. I am giving thee praise with me whole heart. I am giving thee humility in the blood of the Lamb.
I am giving thee love with my whole devotion. I am giving thee yielding with my whole desire. I am giving thee love with my whole heart. I am giving thee affection with my whole sense. I am giving thee existence with my whole mind. I am giving thee my soul, O God of gods.
Praise to the Father, praise to the Son, praise to the Spirit, the three in one. Amen.
Thank you very much. In the monasteries back in the 4th century, they would have prayed this way, in chorus. Even today, in the monasteries and in communities of religious, they pray the liturgy of the hours in this fashion, back and forth. If you go into one of the monastery chapels, the chairs will be facing each other instead of facing all forward. And that is for the purpose of this type of prayer. You know, I've done several retreats up at the Carmelite Spirituality Center in Niagara Falls. And it's actually where Father Jay went to high school, seminary high school. And the chapel there is set up that way. It's very old, but it's kind of cool to pray in that manner, just kind of facing each other and praying in chorus like that. So that's one of the ways Patrick would have prayed. And that's what he would have taught his converts, especially those that entered into the priesthood or into monastery life. So, 4th century, that's when Patrick was born, toward the end of the 4th century. We don't know the exact date. History wasn't recorded then the way it is now. So we just don't know his birthday. We don't know exact date he was, or the year he was born even. But it was sometime in the late 4th century. Britain at that time, Matt, put my PowerPoint up here. Maybe you fell asleep on it. There you go. There's Patrick. And there you go. There's a map of the Roman Empire. Basically the whole civilized world. So the Roman Empire would have been all of this, all the way up to here, including Britain. As you can see, Britain is on the very far end of the whole empire. And at this time, when Patrick was born and when Patrick was alive, Rome was in the process of being invaded by a couple of Germanic tribes called the Visigoths and the Vandals. And what ended up happening was the emperor started pulling his armies away from other areas so that he can shore up the northern lands where the Visigoths and Vandals were trying to capture Roman land and make it their own. So he, in the process of doing that, he pulls all the protection away from Britain. So he pulls the navy, he pulls away all of his armies, he recruits all the young men into the legions, and kind of leaves Ireland pretty much on its own without a whole lot to protect it. Patrick was 15 years old when he was captured. I want to talk a little bit about Ireland first because it's relevant. For lack of a better word, Ireland was tribal. They kind of banded together in little extended family units, and usually there was a king who was really not much more than an Indian chief that we would have seen in the Westerns, right? To make a comparison. They did have all the power. They had all the power. There was no central government. There was no central power. They were just a bunch of, groupings of people with their own little power bases, their own little fiefdoms or kings. The power base was the king himself. Some of the power was shared by his family, and some of the power was shared by the Druids. The Druid would have been the pagan priests for Ireland. They would cast spells, little things like that. They worshipped all the gods that are small g gods that would have represented the different elements of nature. The sun, water, those kind of things. Most popular of all of them was the sun god, because they recognized that the sun was the sun that gave them life in the form of growing their crops and heating and all these kind of things, so that the sun god would have been their favorite. Common people, common men and women that weren't part of the king's family, were little more than slaves. They had no rights. They worked in the fields for a pittance just to survive. In some cases, they could have owned a slave that would come work for them, but in most cases, they didn't have their own slaves. So that's kind of a snapshot of what Ireland was like. The pagans did have a concept of heaven. They called it the outer world. A dwelling place for their small g gods. I keep saying that because I don't want to confuse these gods with the one true God, right? So the outer world is where their gods lived. It's where their deceased would have gone when they passed away. And then it was also a place for other so-called supernatural beings that they had believed in their religion. So Patrick himself would have grown up as a very privileged young man on Britain. Let me explain to you his family situation. Patrick's father was part of the aristocrats. He owned farmland, quite a bit of it. He had a position in the Roman government, and he was also a deacon in the church. So very well respected, had all the comforts that anyone would have had in Britain at that time. Patrick's grandfather is rumored, and again it's rumored, to have been a priest. Now, priests back then could have been married, unlike now. But back then they weren't, in the 4th century. So Patrick's youth was steeped in the Catholic faith, but it was also steeped in privilege, because he didn't want for nothing. He didn't have to do a whole lot. And it made him a very arrogant, very cocky, and very troublesome young man. He would have gone to school. It would have been a tutor, because they didn't have this kind of schools that we understand now, but because his father was wealthy, he would have had a tutor that would have taught him basically mathematics, and reading and writing, some Latin, things of that nature. And his parents would have made sure that he understood his catechism, his catechesis. He would have been baptized, confirmed, received the Eucharist many times as a child, the whole bit. And like a cocky teenager, he goes and turns away from Christ. And he abandons the faith of his parents. I've never heard of that happening before. It happened to Patrick. So those of us who have had teenagers grow up and walk away from the church, there's hope. Not only that they come back to the church, but there's still hope that they could be a great saint. Because Patrick certainly walked that walk and talked that talk. I'm going to share with you now some words that St. Patrick shares in his autobiography, which is called the Confessions, or the Confessio. And he's talking about being captured and his reasoning behind it. He says, I was captured when I was almost 16 years old. I did not really know the true God when I was brought in slavery together with thousands of others. He goes on and he says, all of us deserved this slavery because we had turned away from God and did not keep his commandments. We had not been obedient to our priests, who were encouraging us to do those things necessary for salvation. So God brought down his anger on us and scattered us among the nations, indeed even to the ends of the earth. Now keep in mind, these are not the words of a 16-year-old boy. These are the words of a wise old bishop who has had a lifetime to reflect upon his life, to understand the course of events that have changed him. And now he's owning up to who he was back then. In this particular passage, he reveals a very strong love for Scripture. Paul, you might have picked up on it. He compares his plight to that of the Israelites who had lost their way from God and were exiled into Babylon. You also find humility in his words. That cocky teenager's gone, right? Here we have a wise, faithful man who knows where he's been and knows where he's going. So right now I'd like to invite you to do a reflection with me. I'm going to give you 5 minutes just to sit in quiet reflection. And what I want you to do is imagine a time when you were either disobedient to God or showed a lack of faith and dealt with God and was dealt with by God in some way. And how were you changed for the good? I'm not going to ask you to share this. This is deeply personal. But I'm going to ask you to sit and ponder it just as Mary pondered the many things that she experienced in her walk. Imagine a time when you were disobedient, when your disobedience or lack of faith was dealt with by God. And how were you changed for the good? when I was in my early 30s, I got a job working for a company called Safety Clean, which was an environmental services company. And it didn't take me long to figure out that Safety Clean was a company that if I really worked hard, I could move up the chain of command and really make something of myself. So I started putting in 10, 12-hour days. I was gone more from home than I was home. But every year I got promoted. From service rep from our automotive division into the special markets division, into the industrial division, into a sales manager job. Every year it seemed like I was able to step up that rung of the ladder one more step. I was really going someplace. But our children were small. My wife was working a job, weren't you, honey? And I wasn't there for them. I wasn't there for the kids. And I never realized it until one day I get called into the boss's office. There's a brand new regional manager sitting there. And he says, I have someone else in mind for your job. Just like that, I was demoted back down to the position I had started in 5 years before. And I remember driving home from work that day, tears in my eyes, in prayer, saying, okay, God, I get it. Not my will, but yours. The next day I get a phone call from a headhunter offering me a job. So he took care of me once I realized what a fool I had been. So that's kind of my sharing of this disobedience and lack of faith and where it took me, So, and I think my wife's been much happier ever since, haven't you? I hope so, anyway. So Patrick, in his confessions, let's get back to his story. He speaks of this great sin that he committed when he was 15 years old. That was the cause of this exile into slavery. He doesn't exactly say what the sin is. But he does give us enough information to know that it was grave enough to haunt him for the rest of his life. And I was reading some of the analytics around his life, and these are speculations. It's, different theologians thinking about Patrick's life, right? They make the comments that it had to have been a sin of one of three things: worshiping an idol, a sexual sin, or murder. Something that happened in the span of 1 hour, one day, that left him spiritually wrecked. And for this reason, he says, all of us deserve this slavery because we had turned away from God and did not keep his commandments. So it's important for us to understand, first of all, that God never turns away from us. He is always there. Regardless of where we turn to, he is still there. We can't change what we did. We never can change the history or the past. But we can turn around and move forward in the right direction. We can always walk toward the light. So when Patrick was still 15 years old, his village was raided by pirates. Darlene, welcome.
Sorry I'm late. I took a nap.
Better late than never. So Patrick's 15 years old, and his village is raided by pirates. Now keep in mind, the Roman centurions, the Roman armies, and the Roman navy's gone. They're fighting these Germanic tribes in other places of the empire. They've kind of left Britain on its own. So it was a free-for-all for these Irish pirates to come and just gather up people and sell them into slavery. So Patrick would have had, most likely, had these people entered into his own home, into their villa. Captured Patrick, probably the servants, the neighbors, anyone they could come across. Now the rest of Patrick's family supposedly was on business in another part of the island. So they weren't there, but Patrick was. So they took Patrick, they took the servants, and by Patrick's own words, thousands of other people on this raid. Not everybody got put in the boats. Each person got scrutinized. They assessed whether there was value to sell this person into slavery. And if there was value, they thought they could get a good coin for your person. And then Patrick, 15 years old, strapping young boy, got a lot of years that somebody can get out of this young man, right? So there had to be some value there. So he got put on the boats. Not everybody made the boats. Many were slaughtered. If they didn't have a use for you, these raiders were vicious. They were vicious. So Patrick's age and his physicality was certainly to his advantage, at least to not being slaughtered. Once in Ireland, Patrick would have been sold probably pretty quickly. Now legend has it, and again this is legend, that Patrick was sold to a chieftain druid named Miliuk. It's also equally possible that he was just sold to a common farmer that needed someone to tend his sheep. We really don't know the facts. We just kind of wade through legends sometimes to figure out what really happened. But in his confessions he writes, "When I came to Ireland, I spent each day tending sheep, and I prayed many times a day. Thus I grew more and more in love with God. And as the fear of God increased in me, so did my faith, so that in a single day I would pray more than 100 times, and in the course of the night I would pray nearly as many. When I was tending sheep on the mountains and in the woods and in the dark before the dawn, I would awaken and I would pray in the snow, in the frost, and in the rain. No harm came to me, because there was no idleness in me, as I can now see, for my spirit was fervent." Patrick most likely started out by praying those simple prayers he was taught as a child. "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Hail Mary, full of grace." So on and so forth. But how many times can you say that and not go out of your mind? Eventually, he learned to pray what was on his mind. He eventually learned to tell God who he was and what he felt, what he needed, what he was grateful for, when he found things to be grateful for. All of those things eventually came to Patrick. And he eventually learned to sit and listen and let God speak. Doesn't happen overnight. And it didn't happen overnight for Patrick. It literally took 6 years for Patrick to come from that arrogant kid to this very prayerful young man. 6 years. The psalmist says, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know I am God. That's from Psalm 46. Psalm 62. "My soul is at rest in God alone. My fortress, I shall never fall." So these psalmists knew that God is to be found deep in the silence of our own hearts. That's where we get to know him best. That's where Patrick got to know him best. The Catholic Church has a very strong, and long, and deep tradition of silent prayer. It wasn't invented by Patrick. However, I think he probably came by it organically. But the silent prayer tradition that we celebrate in the Catholic Church really came from the desert mothers and fathers from the 1st, the 2nd, and 3rd centuries. These men and women that went out to the deserts of Egypt be able to pray in silence away from the culture and just to be alone with God so that they could grow holy, the holier. And these men and women were sought after by others. And others joined them, and eventually they built monasteries. And that's where our monastic tradition comes from. It was from the deserts of Egypt, with just a band full of people wanting to find a quiet place, a desert, where they can just grow in holiness. And that's what happened to Patrick in those 6 years in that lush green desert that he was living in. It was a desert because it was free of distractions. It was a desert because it was him and God alone. The sheep they could have not been there. He probably wouldn't have even noticed some of these times when he was in prayer. One of the things that I would encourage everybody to do is always to find a place that you can call your desert. A place where you're free of distractions, where you can sit with God alone. When I got my mother-in-law sitting here in the second row, she's coming out of the Greek Orthodox tradition, and they have a beautiful tradition of having a prayer corner, usually facing the east, and the corner will be lined with various icons of importance to the family, and it becomes a place of prayer, a place to go and just be with God. Across the landscape of Ireland are a number of places that they refer to as desert. There's literally over 500 of these places. So Patrick would have taught the Irish the importance of this physical desert landscape, this lush, not the lush terrain, but this place within. But to find a quiet place. So there are these places, and usually with a monument marking them, that the Irish call deserts, a place to go, to be alone, to be with Christ, to listen to God, to tell God your fears, your desires, your anxieties, everything. So the next reflection is this. When have you sought a desert, a place of solitude, to be alone with your thoughts, to be alone with your prayers, in order to get clarity on something that happened to you or was happening to you or a decision you needed to make? When have you sought a desert, a place of solitude, to be alone with your thoughts, to be alone with your prayers, in order to get clarity about something that had happened to you, was happening to you, or a decision you had to make? Take a few minutes to reflect on it. I'm not sure if some of you are deep in meditation or falling asleep. Really relax. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that for the Irish people in the years after St. Patrick, these desert fathers and mothers were very important to Irish spirituality. And in a number of the monasteries where they've got the big monument cross in front of the monastery, they did in their crosses kind of very much like the Byzantines did, with the images of the different saints built into the leaves of the cross. And for the Irish, two of the saints that were quite often in the upper leaf of the cross was Saint Anthony of Egypt and Saint Paul of Thebes. And these were two of the desert monks that this whole tradition of quiet, contemplative prayer comes out of. So it's that important to the Irish people that these saints have been monumentized for that reason. Another Irish saint that story is tied to solitude was a man by the name of Colin McDowell. Pretty Irish, isn't it? McDowell. He's known for two things. First of all, he pretty much blossomed Christianity on the island of Innisfree, one of the Irish Isles, establishing as many as 7 churches there. But he also was noted for being someone who went and hid in a cave, basically, for 7 years. So he found this desert in a cave. And the cave, from what I understand, is still a pilgrim place that many people visit in Ireland. So that's Colin McDowell. All right. 6 years as a slave. Let's talk about his escape. Now the good stuff starts to happen, right? All right. So Patrick had this deep, abiding prayer life at this point. And God would speak to him, and usually in his dreams. So one night he hears God's voice come to him in one of those dreams, right? And this is the way Patrick himself describes it again in his Confessions. By the way, thank you, Lynn Michaels, for the copy of the Confessions. That was very helpful. So Patrick says, if there was one night I heard a voice in my sleep saying to me, how good it is that you are fasting. You will soon return to your own country. And a little while later, he heard the voice again. This time it said, behold, your ship is ready. Your ship is ready. But the ship was a long way off, Patrick said. He said it was about 200 miles. And I had never been in that place, nor did I know anybody there. But he didn't say this, 200 miles on foot, holy cow, right? That's a long way to go. So shortly after this, I ran away and left the man to whom I had been enslaved to for the past 6 years. And by the strength of God, so not by his own strength, by the strength of God, he's giving credit to God, who has always guided me in good places, I fearlessly reached the ship. And they wouldn't let him on. They were pagans. They weren't Christians. They were pagans. And Patrick stuck to his guns. He knew this was God's will. And he was persistent. Eventually, they allowed him onto the boat. And they had about a 3-day journey to Britain on the waters. And when they get there, they find the area where they landed barren, stripped of all its vegetation. There's no livestock. There's nothing to eat. It's been stripped to serve the Roman armies. So they walked for several days, and they were becoming hungry. The pagans were becoming anxious, angry. And they turned to Patrick and said, "You're the holy boy. Pray to your God, that we may not die, that we may eat." Well, Patrick had been praying the whole time. But for their benefit, he prays out loud. And he prays that God should be there for him. And the next thing you know, there they are, a flock of pigs or a gaggle of pigs or whatever you call a group of pigs. So they slaughtered the pigs, they filled their bellies, and you know what? Those pagan sailors became the very first converts of St. Patrick. Very first converts of St. Patrick. Now, no one ever had been captured by Irish pirates, taken over to Ireland, and returned home. It had never happened. Families were grieving their loved ones from the moment they were captured because they knew they would never return. Yet, 6 years after being captured, Patrick walks through the front door of his family's villa. No longer that cocky, wisecracking teenager. Now he's a man. He's changed. Physically changed. Psychologically changed. Spiritually changed. He is different. But he's also scarred. Some of the experiences that he had in Ireland at the hand of his captors remain with him for the rest of his life, and it's where he draws his tenacity from to continue to work for Christ. So he returns to his family and has a couple of good years. Gets reacclimated, probably gets fattened up a little bit. And then one night, while he's sleeping in his room in the villa, the dreams happen again. God starts talking to Patrick once again. But in the dreams, he doesn't see God and he doesn't hear God's voice. What he sees is a man arriving from Ireland with a large number of letters under his arm. Pretty bizarre. And the man walks into Patrick's room and drops the letters at the foot of his bed. And Patrick starts looking through the letters, and they're all addressed to Holy Boy, the mocking nickname that the Irish had given him while he was a captive. Every last letter was addressed to Holy Boy. And when he opened them, this was the message it said. Come here and walk among us. Come here and walk among us. There were other dreams, other visions, but they all were calling him back to Ireland. So Patrick's next step in his life, and what I'm sharing with you is really what's come from Patrick's own pen as he has written it down in his letters. So there are gaps, so I apologize for that, but I don't want to fill these gaps in with my imagination. That wouldn't be right. So we're going to leave the gaps there, and we can allow you to fill those with
Our imagination.
your own imagination. Yeah, St. Ignatius would encourage, right? So his next step was really to seek training to become a priest. And he found a monastery to go to in Gaul, which is modern-day France, right? Rumor has it that the monastery that was established by St. Martin de Tours, who happened to be his mom's uncle. So little is known about those years at the monastery, being trained to become a priest. We do know that he was first ordained a deacon, and then a priest. His early years in his priesthood, there's no record of that. We don't know if he did that in France, back in Britain, or where. But once he was ordained a bishop is when they sent him to Ireland. So like Patrick's early years, and some of these other years we just talked about, where there's these gaps in the history, we have those gaps in his early years in Ireland. We do know, or we do suspect, that he spent most of those early years in Northern Ireland. Okay? His focus would have been twofold. Number one, to minister to the Christian slaves that were already over there. To bring the Eucharist, to bring Christ to those slaves that had been without the Eucharist for so many years. So that was number one. Number two was to preach to any of the pagans that would listen to him. That wasn't an easy task at all. Now, I talked earlier about the chieftains, the amount of power that they had, right? Now, it's a very rural land, and there's lots of real estate in between these tribal areas. Excuse me. There were about 150 of these tribal areas scattered around. And I had mentioned earlier, too, that it was unsafe to travel into another tribe's area unless you were the king's family, or a druid. So Patrick would have had a king's protection to travel around Ireland at that point. We don't know who those kings were. Those details aren't shared in his letters. But we do know that he would have had to have at least a king with some kind of sympathy toward him, so that he could travel around. Now the kings were the military leaders, as I mentioned. They were the ones that kind of negotiated with the other tribes. But we don't know how many of these kings actually were converted to Christianity. He doesn't really speak about that. But he does speak about their families. So, if you want to influence somebody, who better than their family, right? To do that for you. So Patrick converted the children of the kings, the family of the kings. The kings had too much to lose, but the kids did not. So, and again, Patrick writes in his confession, he says, suffice it to say, nope, wrong spot. He says, how come that in Ireland there was no knowledge of God, and there were idols that were unclean images that were being worshipped, and now they have become a people of God and sons of God. And he says, how come the sons and daughters of Irish kings are becoming monks and virgins consecrated to Christ? One particular Irish woman, he says, who was both noble and beautiful and whom I baptized, came to me a few days afterwards and told me that she had received a message from God to become a virgin of Christ and to draw close to God. And no, it wasn't Claire. But it was the families. So we think about it. He fell away as a youth, but he's bringing these youth to Christ. It's amazing how that's flipped in his story. So as people were converted, Patrick started building monasteries. So there were places where the consecrated could come together and live, where they could pray, kind of shielded from the pagan culture outside the doors. But it was also a place where the Irish could come and be catechized and be taught and to grow. And they started building their homes around the monasteries. And this was really the first semblance of villages that popped up on the Irish island. Like I said before that, it was just kind of spread out in agriculture. So now we have villages popping up around these monasteries. So they kind of became the cultural center for not just the Catholic faith, but for the people in general. The monasteries were pretty well known for transcribing some of the writings of the great saints, the ancient philosophers, the ancient poetry, literature, any kind of written knowledge that you put down. They were transcribing it into volumes, and they were building libraries. And when mainland Europe fell into feudal wars, and one king was destroying another king's area, and monasteries were being burned and destroyed, none of that was happening in Ireland. So a lot of these works were preserved. So they were not lost, because they were preserved in Ireland which again was too far away from everybody else to mess with. And good thing. But these monasteries also gave birth to missionaries, men that would bring their monastic tradition to other parts of Europe. So we have St. Columba, who we have our chapel or our multi-purpose room next door named after. You know, he built the monastery in Iona in Scotland. Then we've got St. Columbanus, who built monasteries as far to the east as Italy. So the monasticism got respread across Europe in a new and more vigilant way because of the Irish. There's also one more missionary I want to talk about. This man was born in Dublin, Ireland, and he came to the United States to become a priest. The year was 1838. And he was sent to establish the very first church in northern Illinois, St. Patrick's. John Francis Plunkett was our first pastor. Born and raised in Dublin. So you know, coming from Ireland, this church was not going to be named St. Anthony's or St. Rocco's. It was going to be Patrick, right? So, as I mentioned before, Patrick's writings really are the only historical account that we have of his ministry and his time in Ireland and his life. And we only have the information that he put down. And there, like I said, there are great big gaps in them because these are just small writings. He didn't write long historical documents. In his writings, though, he's always careful to give credit to God. He doesn't take any credit himself. He knows that the gifts that he had to do what he did came from God himself. Yeah, sometimes forged in fire, because he did not have an easy, passage into adulthood. But everything that God did for him, whether it was hard or recognized as pleasurable, he understood these were gifts from God. There are a couple legends that I said I wanted to talk about. So we'll start with the shamrock. If you ask a kid about St. Patrick, right, the first thing you're going to tell you, oh yeah, he invented the shamrock. If you ask an older kid who's had a little bit of catechesis, he might say, well, didn't he teach people about God using that leaf? Or an adult might say, oh yeah, he taught the Trinity with the shamrock. We have 3 leaves in one plant. Just like there's 3 persons in one God. But the truth is, he probably didn't. We don't know for sure. But I can tell you this. Man, it's an ingenious way to teach the Trinity. So don't ever forget about it. Because if somebody asks you to talk about, well, you got these 3 gods, not one. No, we got one God, 3 persons. Just like a shamrock. Right? Then there's the snakes. Those pesky, nasty, ugly snakes. Did Patrick really chase them out of Ireland? Nah, probably not. From what I've been able to read, the soil isn't necessarily sandy enough for the snakes to really enjoy. The weather's not really great for snakes, and quite frankly, the island's too far away for the snakes to even get there. Unless some knucklehead kid decides he wants a pet. I don't know. But the truth is, Patrick didn't have anything to do with the snakes. Then there's the legend of the Irish cross. We've got a cross. Let me put a picture of it up here. I lost my... Well, you know what an Irish cross looks like, a Celtic cross. So I mentioned earlier that the pagan gods, the Irish had a favorite pagan god, right? It was the sun god. And the symbol for the sun god was a circle, the shape of the sun. So legend has it is Patrick took the cross. Yeah, there's one there. This our symbol for Christ, and he put behind the cross the symbol of the sun god, and said to the Irish people, you don't worship the sun god, you worship the Son of God. And this circle represents the Son of God because it's the same shape as the Eucharist. It's the same shape as the Eucharist. Now, I've also heard it told that the circle represents infinity or eternity. But the legend, actually, with St. Patrick, talks about that circle representing the Eucharist, the source and summit of our faith. So with that, I want to end with prayer. So I'm going to ask you to bow your heads. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.
Always remember to forget the things that made you sad. But never forget to remember the things that made you glad. Always remember to forget the friends that proved untrue. But never forget to remember those that have stuck by you. Always remember to forget the troubles that pass away. But never forget to remember the blessings that come each day. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
May you always have work for your hands to do. May your pockets hold always a coin or two. May the sun shine bright on your window pane. May the rainbow be certain to follow each rain. And may the hand of a friend always be near. And may God fill your hearts with gladness and cheer. And may the Lord bless you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thanks be to God.